everyone, once again I am back in the house of my parental units, terminology which is very weird but also very appropriate for this month, as you'll see soon. And before we get too far into August, even though I know we're already almost 3 weeks in, probably more by the time I put this up, I wanted to do a quick book wrap up for July. So in July, for better or for worse, I'd say for better I guess, I read almost exclusively fantasy and science fiction, and there are a couple reasons for this. One is that fantasy is just my favorite genre, so I tend to buy more books that are fantasy and read more books that are fantasy. But the other reason is that I have been trying to read the entire Hugo shortlist before the Hugo Awards are announced in December? Yeah, it's December. I'm almost done with that. I did most of that reading actually this month. I have one more book remaining on that list, and then I think I might actually try to read all the Nebulas and World Fantasy Awards because there's so much overlap between all of those lists that there's, I think, I don't know, like 19, 18 spots. There's maybe 18 or 19 spots on all three lists. One of them I think is 5 books and the other are 6. I guess that's 17. But there's a huge amount of overlap, so the total is actually more like 9 or 10 books. So I'm going to talk about a lot of those books in this wrap-up. The first one I'm going to talk about, the first one that I read back at the beginning of the month, was All Systems Red by Martha Wells. It's the first book in the Murderbot Diaries. And I really wish that I had better things to say about it. The Murderbot Diaries are about this robot named Murderbot who is designed to kill in this sort of sci-fi universe, but he really doesn't want to kill. He's kind of just like, I just want to sit on my butt and watch TV, which I mean, same. And in this book, and I think later in the series, the 5th book in the series, which is the most recent one, is actually the one that was nominated for the Hugos, but I hadn't read any of the others, so I went to the beginning. In this book, he learns a lot about sort of the nature of what he is and how much he can fight that or not. And the reason that I didn't really enjoy it, I think, is twofold. For one, the book definitely assumes a familiarity with the conventions of science fiction, which, to be honest, I don't really have. I don't read a lot of science fiction. The main science fiction books I've read are like... Does the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle count? Oh wait, maybe that's kind of a spoiler, sorry. So anyway, the fact that I can't really come up with any that I've read recently sort of suggests that I don't know much about the genre. But the world we're sort of plopped into, we're just sort of expected to figure out, like there's this sort of war going on, but I could never figure out why or who was fighting whom or like who we liked even though I guess we're supposed to like Murderbot's team of people. I also didn't really get to know those people as well as I wanted to. They were very thin characters. The most developed character by far was, in fact, Murderbot, who's not even human. And really the book depends, to me, on how much you enjoy the character of Murderbot and how much that alone can carry the entire story. I thought Murderbot was like fun and relatable enough, but I wasn't into them. I'm gonna say them. I think that they use they them pronouns in the book. I wasn't into them enough for it to compensate for the fact that I didn't really understand what was going on and the other characters were super thin. Perhaps the books get better as the series goes on. I know that this is a novella, it's quite short, but the 5th one was nominated in the novel category, so it must be longer. So it's possible that they do get longer, but if this is an indication of how the series goes, I don't think I'm going to read the rest of it, so I gave it 2 stars, pretty much solely based on my own enjoyment of it. The next book I read is A Beautifully Foolish Endeavor by Hank Green, and I listened to the audiobook version of this book. There were a lot of different narrators in it. One of them was Nicole Lewis, who actually read, I think, Giala in the Black Sun audiobook. She reads Maya in this book, so I was really excited to hear her again. And another was Kristen Sia, who does the narration for the audiobook of... Oh, damn, I just did a video on the Women's Prize. No One Is Talking About This. She read No One Is Talking About This, and so I was really excited to see those two again. This book is the sequel to Hank Green's book, An Absolutely Remarkable Thing, which came out a few years ago. I really liked it. My book club recently read it, and because I had already read it, I decided instead to read A Beautifully Foolish Endeavor for that month. I think that in this book, some stuff is much better than in the previous book, and some stuff isn't as good. I'll start with what isn't as good, because then we have something to look forward to. As far as what isn't as good, I didn't think the story was as tight and cohesive as the first book. And this makes sense because it's a much larger scope. We're seeing a lot of different characters deal with the aftermath of both April May's death and how the world is reacting to the knowledge of the Carls, which, if you haven't read the first book, the Carls are these sort of robot-like figures that just appear on the earth in many different cities one day. April May is the first person to find them, and so she becomes like internet famous because of that. And there's like this sort of nefarious thing going on with a large corporation created in part by one of the antagonists from the previous book. And so I thought all of those story threads just took a really long time to be knit together. This is a longer book than the first one too. However, I did think that I would say the writing was equally strong as in the first book, and the characterization was stronger. Partly because we get to see the perspective of other characters in the book besides April May. We get her former girlfriend Maya, her friend Andy, her other friend Miranda, who they met over the course of the previous book. She's a PhD student at Berkeley. And I thought that all of those characters were much more nuanced in this book. Not that they were bad in the previous book, but we just couldn't see into their heads because it was a first-person perspective from April. So we got all of their perspectives too in this book, which was cool. I also think that the audiobook really hits the nail on the head with all of these characters. Every character is so well cast, and I think that that really enhanced my enjoyment of the story, as well as my ability to tell each character apart. The only complaint I have about the audiobook is that the person who reads Andy has to do a Trinidadian accent for a character that Andy knows, and the accent's not very good. But other than that, he does a good job, and all the other readers do too. I would give this in total, I'd say like 3.5 stars, because it was very good. I wouldn't say it's a favorite of mine or something I'm going to be like talking about to a lot of people, but I thought it was good. Next book was another book on the Hugo list. Actually, the sequel to this one is on the Hugo list. I hadn't read this one, so this is the one that I read. That is Gideon the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir? Okay, a few minutes later, I unfortunately was not able to find an interview of her saying her name out loud, which is usually what I do in these situations. So, author of Gideon the Ninth, I'm sorry both for that and also for what I'm about to say about your book. Gideon the Ninth is a very difficult book to categorize because it is definitely fantasy, but once you start going beyond that, like what it's about and what kind of fantasy it is, it gets a lot more nebulous. It is set in space, kind of, although people are on planets most of the time. They are traveling between planets. Necromancers exist, and there are 9 houses of necromancers that serve the deity of this universe, but they haven't really seen or heard from him in a long time, so they really don't know what's up with him. And also, all of the necromancers have cavaliers who fight on their behalf, and that's what Gideon is, although she doesn't really want to be a cavalier. There just weren't that many choices on her planet because almost every single child on her planet was killed by a plague around the time that she was born, except for herself and Harrow, who is like the princess slash like royal heir to the 9th house, and then also one other kid. And that kid is a coward, so he skedaddled, and so Gideon ended up being the cavalier, and she has to travel with Harrow to the 1st house so that all of the houses can go through this sort of competition to see which one is the best or something. Except that doesn't really happen. There's a murder mystery instead in space with necromancers, and yeah. As you can tell, I had a really hard time following the plot of Gideon the Ninth. If you like all of the very different discrete elements that make up this book, you will probably really, really like it, but if you are not super into a few of them, like I'm not super into mysteries, and I also don't know much about like science fiction type spacey stuff, then you might get a little bit lost. There is a lot to appreciate here. I think that the author does know how to write a funny line of dialogue. There were a lot of dialogue moments that I highlighted and ha-ha'd in the margins. And I did read all the way to the end. I did kind of want to know how the mystery turned out, so I guess there's that. However, I was just overwhelmed by not only the scope of the story, but also the sheer amount of characters. There are 8 houses that have all traveled to the first house, so each of them has at least one necromancer, in many cases 2, and at least 1 cavalier, in some cases 2. And so you have to keep all of these futuristic names straight. A lot of them have characteristics that some of the others have, and so it can be very difficult to sort of pull all of that apart and remember who's who. There's just so many One thing that I think would have helped with this is the author does include sort of a case file at the end of the book with detailed information on all of these characters. Even though she does have a list of them at the beginning, that information that would have helped me to keep those characters straight would have been really useful at the beginning of the book. I can understand why maybe she didn't want to. Damn it.
Donald, here is your reminder. Fortune to do it back exercises.
Are you through? Anyway, I can see why the author maybe didn't want to include that stuff right at the beginning, because it could potentially be spoilery, but I still think it would have been useful to have that stuff at the beginning, because then I could maybe have figured out who was who. One other thing that I've seen a lot of people talk about with this book is the modern speak. This is supposed to be like 10,000 years into the future, but everybody still talks like it's 2017. It's kind of memey. There's stuff like, she noped out of there, and ooh, that sucks ass. You know, stuff that people say now. And I know that some people found that jarring. I actually thought it was kind of cute. It was almost like a subtle indication that, oh, maybe this is fiction. Sort of like a little wink to the reader, but maybe I'm thinking too hard. It was hard for me to get invested in this story, even though I do admire the work that went into it, so I'm gonna give it like 2.5 stars, which is like a pretty neutral rating for me. I didn't love it, but I get why. I get the hype. I do get the hype. I'm probably not reading the second book though. Next book I'm going to talk about is also a Hugo book. It is The Calculating Stars by Mary Robinette Kowal. It's the first book in the Lady Astronaut series, and the third book is the one that was nominated for a Hugo this past year. It's kind of funny that I just said that I can't come up with any recent sci-fi reads, because this is fairly like science fiction-y, although in some ways it's more of a historical fiction novel, which may be why I liked it so much. This book is about Elma York, who is a Jewish woman pilot and mathematician. She has a PhD from Stanford in mathematics, which is especially impressive considering it's the 1950s. And she and her husband are on a vacation in the mountains when a meteorite falls on Washington, D.C. and just obliterates the entire surrounding area. Elma had family in D.C., so most of that family is gone, so that's especially devastating for her and for others who lost their families, but a more serious situation is going down in that climactic effects from the meteorite are causing extremely rapid climate change, and to the point where humans are going to have to evacuate Earth. So a lot of this book is sort of the setup and the planning for colonization on Mars, which is going to come, I think, in the next 2 books. Now, Elma really, really wants to be an astronaut and to be one of the first to go into space, not only because she wants to continue living her life and not be on the dying Earth, but because she is extremely qualified for it. Like I said, she's a PhD in math. She's a pilot. She was a pilot in World War II, and her husband as well is very involved in this effort, so she wants to do it for all of those reasons, and also the idea of being an astronaut is just very exciting to her. Unfortunately, because this is the 50s, women are just not encouraged, and in fact discouraged actively from doing such things. One thing I admire about this book is the fact that even though it's from the perspective of a white Jewish woman, it still does take a look at the challenges other minorities face. For example, Elma realizes throughout the story that as much as it sucks for her to not be able to go into space, she at least has more of a chance than a lot of Black women she knows who would be qualified, but they just don't have enough piloting hours to be able to go because that's a requirement. Black women weren't allowed to be pilots in World War II, so it's basically impossible for them to get those requirements. I also super give props to the author for the amount of research she put into this book. She said in her afterword that she didn't know much about astrophysics, or math or anything like that, but all of her characters really sound like they know what they're talking about. She mentions a lot of people that helped her on this journey, and it really, really shows how seriously she took this project. I can't say I loved everything about this book because some characters are basically like good or bad depending on whether the plot wants them to be, and they don't really develop. They just sort of swing one way or the other, and that can be a little annoying. The writing can also get a little bit cheesy as well. But overall, I thought this was a solid first book in this series with some very interesting characters, an interesting setting that's very well researched and explored. I also liked the little historical details that are sprinkled throughout to let us know that this is still history, even though it's alternate history. For example, Don Herbert, who was sort of like the Bill Nye before Bill Nye, he had a children's science TV show called Mr. Wizard, actually calls Elma because he met her during the war and asks her if she wants to be a guest on his show. I'd give this book 4 stars. I think it's really good. And I'm looking forward to reading the rest of the series. Next up is a book that probably of all the books I read this month is the least like science fiction fantasy oriented, and that is Bring Me the Head of Quentin Tarantino. This is a collection of short stories by Julián Herbert, and it was translated into English from Spanish by Christina MacSweeney. There are 10 stories in this volume. I know it looks pretty skinny, but there are 10. One of them is maybe 40 or 50 pages long, and then the others are much shorter. Several are only 2 to 3 pages. And many of them do contain sort of magical realism type elements. One of my favorites is about a guy who finds sheet music in his teeth and starts promoting this piece as like an original piece that sprung from his head, like Zeus from Athena from Zeus's head. No, it was not Zeus from Athena's head. That would be cool though. And some of them are more realistic, but kind of surreal-like. The title story, Bring Me the Head of Quentin Tarantino, which is an objectively fabulous title, is about a criminal in Mexico whose goal is to capture and kill Quentin Tarantino for the crime of looking exactly like him. And he kidnaps a film critic and professor who specializes in Tarantino's movies in order to help him understand Tarantino. That's another very good story in this book. There are some in here that I didn't really love. There's this one really short story where it was all set on public transport, and all this guy can talk about is like how fat this woman is that he sees. But she's hot. Like, she's hot, but she's also fat. It was just very like men writing women to me. But most of the stories in here are not like that. Most of them are very innovative and make you think, especially about criminal activity in Mexico. A lot of these stories are making a point about the lives of criminals in Mexico, where the author is from. I go into a little bit more detail about each of these stories on my Goodreads account, so you should follow that if you haven't already. Overall, I would give this collection maybe 3.5 stars. I averaged the star rating I gave to each story, and the mean rating came out to 3.1, but I do like the writing of this author. I do like his ideas, even if I don't always super connect with them, and so I bumped it up to 3.5. Christina MacSweeney also does a great job with the translation because she has this way of being able to translate very like low street talk sort of diction and also very academic diction, but she does both extremely well. Last book I read was The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. This was another pick for my book club. I actually finished it not too long ago, but I wanted to include it in the July wrap-up because I did start it in July, and I also didn't want it to be stuck with all my Women in Translation reads from August. This is a very difficult book to describe and categorize. It's set partly in our world, the United States present day, and partly in this sort of underground secret society of guardians of stories. And this world is set around this place called the Starless Sea. There are whole coalitions of different people who are dedicated to protecting stories in this book. And the infrastructure of this world and how it's developed is by far the best part of the book. It's really astounding, Erin Morgenstern's imagination, like how much she can stuff into one book. So in a lot of ways, this book is kind of a travelogue for her fictional world that she's created. We see things like a life-size dollhouse that's composed of all of the memories of children that have played with dollhouses. So it's sort of this like infinite house with nobody really living in it. Also an underground library that people train for years to protect, and the guardians can't speak. Huge abandoned cities whose past we get a look into as the characters walk through them, you know, things like that. Her writing is beautiful as well, and I liked the different fairy tales that she uses to sort of prop up her story and give it a little bit of mythology, like a little bit of texture. However, the actual characters of this story and the actual plot of this story are just not very compelling. Our main character is named Zachary Rollins, and he is a graduate student in Vermont who works in video game design, but he loves reading. And he gets sort of caught up in this attempt to like save this world from destruction, or maybe destroy it, kind of. He's like this prophesied person that they've been waiting for. I don't know. I don't know what this story is about, man. The plot is pretty nebulous. You sort of have to like just be along for the ride in that sense. And the characters are, with the possible exception of Zachary and his friend Kat, are not super compelling, although I think we're sort of made to believe that they should be, which is a little bit annoying. For this book, you really just have to be willing to hang out with Erin Morgenstern in this world that she's created, and if you don't want to do that, then you can go home. I would give it 3 stars because I did enjoy the experience of reading the book, and I do admire Morgenstern's imagination. I just don't think as a book, it did what a book generally should do. I felt like the actual book-like elements, like the plot and the characters, were just not so good. I also listened to the audiobook version of this story. It was narrated by many different people. Dominic Hoffman read Zachary Rollins' storyline, and the 5 other storylines were read by 5 other narrators. I highly, highly recommend the audiobook if you're going to read this book. It made it a lot easier for me to pay attention to the story and remember like what part I was on, and the narrators are all excellent. Okay, that's it for July. That's everything I read in July, and next time you see me might be for my wrap-up for August, but I might have something planned for a little bit earlier than that. I hope I can get that done because it'll be really cool. Won't say anything else, but I'll see you when I see you. Bye.